We're going. This is UPA's agenda for this afternoon's meeting, and you will soon see that there is a product emerging from eggs having to do with the treatment of depression, a potential antidepressant drug. And Dr. George Young, our President of Research and Development, will give you a more detailed discussion and description of what this is all about. Some people hear the word antidepressant and don't really appreciate the nature of depression and its impact on individuals, on families, and on society. So we thought it would be appropriate to just initiate and start our discussion with a little description of what depression is. Some of you likely have had some personal connection with this topic, but in the event that you didn't, just bear with me for a couple of minutes here. So, major depression. What is a major depressive disorder? This is also known as major depression or clinical depression, and this is a depression. It's not the kind of depression that all of us experience when we've had some sort of adverse event happening in our lives. We've had an accident or an injury, or someone in our family has died. Of course, we get upset and depressed. That's a short-lived kind of depression. But major depression is of a chronic nature. It's something that will last most of the day and occurs most days, and it may last weeks, months, or beyond that. And the important thing is that it interferes with the activities of daily living. Some of the symptoms of depression are listed here on the board before you. Not everyone who has a depression has all of these symptoms. Some people do, but not all do. So irritability, the feeling of being withdrawn, fatigue, lethargy, lack of concentration so that you really can't do your work. It leads to lack of motivation to do anything. This dark cloud that hangs over, this cloud of hopelessness and helplessness, appetite disturbances, sleep disturbances, decreased interest in sexual activity, unexplained aches and pains, crying spells, sitting in the corner and just crying for no apparent obvious reason, lack of motivation, as I said, suicidal thoughts, sometimes suicidal actions. And in the elderly, symptoms may not be as obvious as all of the ones listed on the board here. What are the causes of major depression? For the most part, we don't know what the causes of depression are. Basically unknown. There's no question that there's some genetic element to it. There's also no question that there's some chemical element to it. And I highlight the word neurochemicals, like brain chemicals. I highlight that because this is the area of our discussion this afternoon. You're going to hear something about the impact of eggs on brain chemicals. There are risk factors: trauma, stressful events, alcohol, some medical conditions. In certain medical conditions, and some of them are listed on the board here before you, there's an increased incidence of depression in hypertension, in diabetes, in coronary artery disease, etc. Some medications do it. Aging. Aging is a risk factor for depression, and there's good evidence to show, particularly in men, that as men get older, the incidence of depression goes up. And however, women have a higher incidence overall of depression. And depression is a problem of immense magnitude around the world. It's incredible how depression has impacted upon society in general, all around the world. 450 million people have a mental or behavioral disorder. This isn't all depression. But this just gives you an idea of this, and much of this is depression, but this is not all depression. 1 million people commit suicide each year, with depression as the most, as the underlying factor. 4 of the leading causes of living with a disability have to do with a neuropsychiatric disorder, and depression is probably the highest among them. 1 in 4 families has at least one member with a mental disturbance, and the commonest among those is depression. In developed countries, the cost of mental health disturbances, can you imagine, 3 to 4% of GNP? It's quite incredible. And only those, only perhaps up to 70% are actually, are maybe untreated. 150 million people suffer from depression at any given moment. And we'll see some data on incidence. Here is depression in Canada. And this is now major depression, major debilitating depression. 1 in 5 women at some time in their life will experience a major depressive episode, which may be short-lived or chronic in nature. 1 in 10 men, 10% of men, will have this experience. And at any given time, 1.5 million Canadians are faced with severe major depression. Unfortunately, fewer than 1/3 of these numbers seek medical help. How much does mental health cost in general? Well, here's some data from 1998, $14.4 billion. This is in Canada. In 2011, $51 billion. Final 2 slides coming up. This is the second to the last. Depression is a major workplace issue. And here are the data, or some data. In 2002, 1 million employed Canadians 18 years of age and older reported having a major depressive episode during the past year. And mental health claims are the fastest growing category of disability costs in Canada. Final slide, which you can read at your leisure, is a statement by the World Health Organization excuse me, indicating the enormity of the problem. There's nothing like having firsthand information about what depression can do to an individual. Ron Ellis is a spokesperson for CAMH, that's the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, the University of Toronto's psychiatric facility. Ron has been an advocate for depression, for antidepressant, and he's here to give you his own personal story. Ron Ellis.
Yes, good afternoon. My task here today is to try and put a face on Dr. Bain's presentation. Depression is debilitating, defeating, deepening gloom. And for a 10-year period in my life, I experienced the frustration of trying different drugs that took 6 to 8 weeks to show any positive effects, if any, over and over again. I also experienced the dreaded side effects from numerous drugs such as anxiety, weight gain, mood swings, and a feeling of hopelessness that comes with this disease. As well as being hospitalized 3 times over a 10-year period, I took a 1-year short-term disability leave from my workplace. So I'm sure you can imagine the impact this all had on my family. My 2 children were in their teens at the time. But I'm happy to say I'm here today enjoying my grandchildren. So help is available. But we do need improved medications. They're long, long overdue. But there is good news. You're going to hear about a new potential drug called Relidep. And studies to date have shown that it has the potential to be a market leader because of its effectiveness, its quick action, and of course, one thing that's very important, lack of side effects, if any. In 1972, I had the pleasure of representing all of you in this room in a wonderful hockey series, and I think Canada was very proud at that time. But this is also a wonderful Canadian story in the making, and I am excited to be on this team because we're going to make it happen. So, ladies and gentlemen, together I really believe we can change how depression is going to be treated in the future. So now for the rest of the story, I'd like to introduce my associate, Dr. George Young.
Good afternoon. Just before we start, I'd just like to point out the name Relidep is based on Ron Ellis's name. It is in honor of him and his contributions in terms of spreading awareness and understanding of this disease. Ron spoke a little bit about not only what he suffered, but how difficult the treatment was and how the treatments did not do very well for him. In fact, there are a lot of drugs out there to treat depression, and they do work to some degree, but they're all lacking, partly because they're all very similar in the way they work. They work on the same brain chemicals, they work in a very similar fashion, so they work equally well or poorly, and they have the same type of side effects. And the three major issues is they don't work for everyone. So there's a group that fail on these drugs, and they have no help. It takes, as Ron was saying, a long time to see benefit from all of these drugs, and the despondency that occurs with the disease is terrible, and it's terrible to be stuck in that situation for 6 to 8 weeks before you feel any effect. And most patients actually won't wait that long. They'll just get off the drug. They just feel it's not working. The third is the side effects. I won't go through them here. I will discuss those further. But those side effects can be terrible, terrible enough that it makes it almost impossible to stay on the drug as well. So even after 30 years or more of therapies out there, patients are still suffering, patients are still looking for something better. So very interestingly, we looked at fertilized eggs as a platform for drug discovery. There's a certain stage in the development of the egg, or in any development, where something happens. Stem cells get produced. And a lot of you may have heard about stem cell research in the media in terms of what the medical potential is. And a lot of people think of stem cells from human embryo, but we looked at fertilized hen's egg, and the undifferentiated cell is an undifferentiated cell. These cells can come up and turn into something fantastic later, and that's what we have been able to tap into in looking at the fertilized egg. There is a very specific moment that we have to capture to get these stem cells, and we have a patented proprietary method of extracting these cells, and this has been what underlies our potential treatment for depression, Relidep. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how Relidep works, a little bit about depression. I won't go through a great amount of detail scientifically, but if people want to ask those questions later, that's fine. But Dr. Bain was saying we don't understand the exact cause of depression, but what we do understand is that there are certain brain chemicals that are, if they're in excess in the brain, cause chronic damage. So there is a neurochemical called NK2, neurokinin 2, and another one called glutamate, that when in excess will cause damage to the brain. In most individuals, everyone has these neurochemicals. They're not bad in themselves, but it's when you can't deal with them. When they start to overwhelm your ability to protect your brain, you get this chronic damage. And there are other things that can damage your brain as well this way. But when you have this chronic brain damage, that is what underlies the depression. So what happens with Relidep is it blocks to a degree or modulates the amount of NK2 and glutamate in your brain. It doesn't block it completely, but it modulates it. Thereby, reducing or stopping the chronic brain damage and stopping depression. Now, this is very exciting because this is not how the other drugs work. The other drugs work on a different set of neurochemicals that may in fact affect glutamate or NK2 somewhere down the line, but it takes a long time because it's indirect. On top of it, it affects a bunch of other things that you don't want affected in your treatment of depression, and that's why you see a lot of side effects. So this has been, from a scientific perspective, a really innovative approach to the treatment of depression. In the next few slides, I'm going to just show you some data comparing the results we saw in a small study we did on Relidep against some of the other major drugs on the market. And this data from the other drugs is just their published data, and we didn't compare them in our study. But the three drugs are Effexor, Lexapro, and Cymbalta. And what I'm showing you here is the response rate to the drug. And response is, when you look at depression, you usually measure them on a scale, and the scale we use is the Hamilton Depression Scale. When you're depressed, your score is very high. So these are all studies in depressed patients, and what we're looking for when we say a patient has responded is that their Hamilton depression score dropped by 50%. That means that the treatment worked. So what we see for Effexor is it's between 48 and 77%, depending on the study, got that 50% or better response. Lexapro was between 37 and 77, Cymbalta between 49 and 71. And what we saw with Relidep, depending on how you cut the data, between 70 and 81% response rate. So that is at least as good, if not better, than anything else on the market, which in itself is very exciting. What I'm not going to show you in detail here, but what is also exciting is that at least half the patients in the study had failed on other drugs. They'd been on Lexapro, they'd been on Effexor, and they have failed. They could not get a response. But once they got on Relidep, they got a response. And that is something we didn't intend on studying, but a fantastic finding when we realized it was there. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the time to clinical benefit, and that means how long did it take to get that 50% response. Again, same comparator drugs, and usually for those drugs it's anywhere between 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes as fast as 5, but usually in that time frame. That's a very long time to be suffering a disease like this. Ron didn't quite say it, but he alluded to it, but every day feels like forever, right? It's just a terrible disease. What we found with Relidep is we found that response occurred within 2 weeks, so almost 4 times faster than the other drugs. What this means to patients is incredible, and what it means to patient compliance is incredible. If patients can start to feel better sooner, they're much more likely to stay on drug and much more likely to get the benefits. The third major finding we had from our study was on the side effects. Now, antidepressants have a lot of side effects, and one of the reasons, again, I talked about is that the way they work on neurochemicals that are not specific to depression, so they have effects on other parts of your brain, and they'll affect other parts of your health. And what I've shown you here, again, is a comparison with Effexor, Lexapro, and Cymbalta, and I've shown you some of the side effects. I haven't listed all of the side effects because that would actually wrap around the room. A lot of side effects associated with antidepressants. But I've shown you some of the major ones, and one of them is nausea, the next is headache, insomnia, nervousness, anxiety, and sexual dysfunction. And you can see that there is a fairly significant percentage of side effects in patients. There are others. Weight gain is another one that Ron alluded to, and again, that's an important one, and there are a few others. The important thing to see here is that for Relidep, in our study, we saw one side effect, and that side effect was a mild transient nausea. We did not see sexual dysfunction, and we looked specifically for that. We did not see weight gain, and we looked specifically for that. We did not see insomnia. We did not see headache. We did not see these things. It doesn't mean that they wouldn't occur at all, because we haven't studied thousands and thousands of patients yet, but it means that if they're occurring at a much lower rate than you see with the other drugs. And again, that is a fantastic thing for the patients. They're suddenly now able to have access to something that might work for them, but at the same time might not cause them these debilitating side effects. And patients are really hoping for something like this to come along. We also looked at how long, our initial study of Relidep was an 8-week study, which is standard for antidepressants. You study the patients for 8 weeks and see what the response looked like. But for those who responded on drug, we were able to keep them on drug and follow them for up to 2 years. So this long-term study looks at the duration of effect over a 1-year period. So I'm showing you the data from 1 year, since not all patients went all the way through to 2 years. And what we can see within the 1-year period is 90% of the patients remained relapse-free, meaning to say they did not go back into a depressive state. So they were depressed, they're no longer depressed, and they stayed no longer depressed. 80% sustained that 50% decrease from baseline, so that response, that is as large as 50%. At the beginning of this part of this phase of the study, 60% were in remission. That means their depression score went so low, they had no sign of clinical depression, 0 sign. And by the end of the 1-year period, 80% went into remission, which suggests that the drug continues to work for these patients and they continue to improve as long as they use it. And during this time period, for up to 2 years, we continue to see no side effect other than that transient and mild nausea. So we've been able to look at not only patients in the short-term kind of clinical setting to see how fast and how well it works, but we're also able to see that this effect is sustained, and the lack of side effect is also sustained. So why are we telling you this? What's very interesting is the tie-in with the eggs. This, from a medical perspective, is looking at a natural source product, so sourced from the fertilized hen's egg. And the process for us is to take the eggs and in a certain time period from the hatcheries, bring it to a facility, a laboratory where we can extract the stem cells and create the finished product, which is an oral capillin. In fact, with the help of the Egg Farmers Association, we were able to study some of this manufacturing process, and we want to continue doing that. And we've now realized that we need approximately 1 egg to make the daily dose that we need for Relidep. And before, it was much more than 1 egg. We've been able to really look at that process. I'm going to show you just a little bit about what we did in the next couple of slides. So we ran a small study, and this was not anything very fancy because the manufacturing process, although proprietary, is not arduous. It's not something that's undoable. So we did a small study manufacturing 3 different batches of Relideps under different conditions. Scott Graham actually helped us out. He brought the eggs to the lab, sat in on a lot of the process, and what he did is he brought us 3 batches, 30 eggs per batch, of fertilized eggs, fertilized for 8 days. Okay, the differences in the batches were the incubation period. The first batch, they were incubated for 5 days. The next batch, they were incubated for 24 hours. The last batch, they were incubated for 3 hours. And what we wanted to do was to compare these to the original product that we used in our study to see if they were chemically the same or chemically similar. So we had these fantastic scientists in the lab working really hard on this. They came in, they brought the eggs in, they cracked the eggs, they extracted the process. Did you run the mass spec for us as well? No? Okay. Well, he didn't run it, but the results of the mass spec are here. Now, I'm not going to try to explain what all this means, but basically these are chemical profiles of the 4 batches, the 3 batches, and 1 is against the reference standard, which is the product that we use. So the height of the peak doesn't matter, but what's important is the location of the peak, and you can see 2 peaks that are consistent in all of those, and those peaks are associated with the active ingredient in our product. So what we were able to see is that, in fact, with these different incubation periods, we're able to get a chemical profile very similar to our original dose. So we now know we can use, we don't have to use a 3-hour window. We can actually go as much as 5 days. That's a very important, exciting finding for us. This is a very important step in understanding our manufacturing process, and we need to continue to look at this manufacturing process to see how we can optimize and utilize the kind of infrastructure that's already in place by groups like yours and be able to supply the global demand. I'll talk a little bit about what that might look like in a few slides. So we have some ongoing feasibility work with the Egg Farmers of Ontario. There's a couple of key questions we're looking at next. One is, does suspending the incubation with refrigeration affect the material quality? And the answer is no. It becomes much easier for us to manufacture, because then in fact we don't have to be so tight in our window of getting the eggs from the hatchery to the lab. Another question is, can small, medium, and medium eggs be used, not just large? And theoretically, there should be no difference to us. But what's interesting about that is, from what I understand, is for the industry, where a lot of these eggs are not well utilized as much as the large eggs, they can be utilized for this medical advance. And by the same token, whether it's male or female egg, doesn't really look like it matters very much to us either, though we have to study that. So we can utilize those eggs as well in terms of for the medical product. Can the eggs from different types of birds, broiler versus layer breeders, for example, matter? And again, theoretically, no, but these are questions that we will actually have to study to be sure. So there's a lot of ongoing work that we hope to do with the Egg Farmers of Ontario to understand the efficiencies that we can gain from the manufacturing process and how we might be able to utilize the infrastructure already in place in your processes. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the antidepressant market, just to give you a feeling for what this means, not only in terms of to the patients, but to the egg farmers, to what it is for the egg industry. So the global sales, and this is just in terms of from the pharmaceutical perspective, of antidepressants in 2010 was $20.6 billion. This is not a small problem, it is not a small disease, and it is a big, big sector within the pharmaceutical industry. What we've looked at from different research sources is that if a new agent entered the market that had any superiority over the current drugs, such as Effexor, it would capture 25% of the market share or more. So 25% or more of the 20.6 billion market. And what that represents is well over 10 billion doses per year. And what that means in terms of the need for eggs, well over 10 billion eggs per year. Okay, that's the implication. So it is a huge, huge problem that requires a unique solution and has a huge opportunity, not only for the medical community, but for the egg farmers as well. Now, just to get an understanding of the product itself, we have patents on the process, meaning the process of extraction and actually making the product. We have patents on the use of the product, so the fertilized hen's egg extract for use in depression and related diseases. And we also have patents on the key active molecules that underlie how this works in depression and against other disease. But the fact is that even once the patents expire, in terms of for the company, the product will still be made. So the eggs will still be required. So this will be something that will be ongoing. We will need, once this reaches market, we will need these eggs. We'll keep needing these eggs until such time that depression is no longer a problem. So what do we need to do? So as a company, what we are looking to do is to go to the next stage of our product. So if you look on the left of this